go across and we're going to come back into Europe from Canada, where John's been sitting. We're going to come back to France, where the wonderful Andy Churr is sitting. And Andy, if you want to unmute yourself, and if you've got slides, now is your opportunity to start sharing them. Andy is now going to, Andy and myself, so we've done lots of work together over the years, and whilst Andy is not a geologist, he is still a wonderful person. Everybody is a wonderful person. And what Andy is going to be talking about is really delving into some of those other complex areas that John was mentioning that need to obviously be absolutely integral with regards to how do we ensure that we are mining, processing, buying and selling all of those raw materials in the most responsible way possible. So Andy, are you able to share your screen? And if not, we will be able to share from our end.
I should be able to, but I'll share it a little bit later. So let's hope it works. Thanks very much, Sarah. And it's great to be joining everybody this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and also for all the hard work that's gone into this. And to my fellow presenters, thank you for giving me a fantastic setup and platform to continue exploring these issues of complexity. So as Sarah may have mentioned earlier, I'm not in London. I'm currently sitting high up in the French Pyrenees, in a little village called Corsedy. I'd be very surprised if anybody's heard about it. It's not very well known. But it has been producing some of the best quality iron ore since the 2nd century BC. And that continued up until 1986. And at the height, I think there were hundreds of people employed in the mine from various villages. And the little village that you drive through when you come to Corsedy was teeming with hotels, bars, cafes, restaurants, and even 2 nightclubs that employed most of the residents of the village. I had the fortune of meeting the last DJ from one of the nightclubs as well. Today, however, there are about a grand total of 5 jobs that still exist within the entire commune. So it's clear that yes, mining can be a real force for good. It can really present host communities and economies, as well as governments and societies, with huge opportunity for development and for improvement by converting natural capital into economic capital. But it can also have very long-lasting and negative consequences if a lot of these issues that we've been discussing today are not thought of early enough and well enough in order for us to make the right decisions across the life cycle of the mine. So what I'd like to try to do today is just set out how companies actually start thinking about all of these different constraints and issues across the entire life cycle, and what opportunities exist where we might be able to start to think differently and do things differently and start to bring all of these complex issues together. I'll also touch a little bit on the concept of closure, because I think it's important to really understand what are things going to look like at the end of the mine. There's so much thinking about how do we find mines, how do we develop mines, how do we extract the ore. But actually, it's probably not really for most of our lifetimes that we'll be thinking about closing it. Many mines, I mean, the mine just behind me up on the mountain has been mined for 2,000 years, quite successfully, until things changed. And I'll get into a little bit about that and how we can maybe do that differently. So I'm going to try to share my screen now, and hopefully this will work. It didn't work earlier, but let's give it a go. Just checking, can you see that? Great.
Perfect.
So once the geologists like Sarah and John and others have found a deposit that looks interesting during the exploration phase, the next step is really about saying, well, what options exist for us to extract this ore? They'll run an options analysis process then with techno-economists in the pre-feasibility, select obviously the most valuable option, and that goes through to a feasibility stage study where there'll be some refinement going on. things will start to look a little bit less good than they did because we've got more information, as John was mentioning. We understand a little bit more about the ore body, but also the constraints that are being placed on us by society, by the environment, by regulations, etc. But eventually there'll be some optimization to that design, and we get something that's good to go for a construction point of view, where we say, right, well, this is what we think the value of this mine is, by taking all of the future cash flows, so the costs and the revenues, putting those all into an NPV model, or net present value model, which says, right, this is our best guesstimate of what this mine is worth. Let's go ahead and start constructing it. But Sarah, as you know, and most other people involved, things very, very seldom go 100% according to plan. So what happens when things go wrong? Well, it sometimes depends when they go wrong. If something goes wrong in construction and there's a delay, either due to a technical issue or due to, let's say, someone was starting to construct now during a COVID pandemic lockdown, or there's community protest, and that delays the construction of the mine by just a few months, it can have a very, very significant impact on the value of the mine. Throughout the operation, there'll be a whole host of unforeseen or unwanted events that will happen, and that will decrease the value, but there'll also be some upswings. So there could be shortages of a commodity, and that will give us an upswing in the price. So we have some positive risks as well, which will be resulting at the end of the life of mine with a value that's a little bit closer to what we imagined it would be, which is great news. Then it comes to closure. And we say, right, well, when we were building this mine, this is what we thought we were going to have to do to close it. When we were operating it, this was the framework that we were existing under. But now things have changed. Actually, there's this thing called the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Society's not so happy with what we were planning to do in order to close it. And it's unfortunately going to cost us so much more to close it. So just to be clear, closing a mine is easy, but responsible closure, which means we fulfilled all of our obligations, the mine isn't polluting the environment, and there isn't a major damage to society at the end of the mine, is much harder to do. One way of mitigating this risk is to make sure that the mine is positioned in the correct area of the cost curve for the industry. So very quickly, just to show you an example from copper, this is from 2017. I think prices are more or less similar at the moment. Really, what you want to be is a producer that's somewhere over here in the cost curve. So that means you are able to produce a ton of copper at a low cost relative to what it's selling for in the market. Where you don't want to be is over here on the right-hand side of the graph, where it's costing you more to produce copper than you can actually sell it for. But unfortunately, if your costs go up, and they tend to go up at the end of the life of mine, or the price comes down, then you see a lot more mines being potentially forced to close early, not because they've run out of ore, but because it's no longer economically feasible to extract that ore. So this is the complexity that that mining companies need to deal with today. And nobody said that it was easy, and it seems to be a moving feast, and everybody's got an opinion on what to do. The reality is that it is very different for every single mine. The constraints, the social, the environmental constraints are very different. So being able to think long term about what things might look like, so that we don't work ourselves out of any options by the way in which we are exploiting a mine, I think is the key thing. What we ideally need to do is to try to understand what is the true cost of operating and closing a mine responsibly, so that we can make fully informed decisions along the life cycle. So should we build this mine in the first place? Or are there better opportunities now that we understand what the constraints are and the true cost will be? And secondly, how do our short and medium term mine plans take into consideration all of the technical and economic constraints, but also the social, environmental, and governance constraints that are increasing on mines? If we take, for example, the cost of social closure. This is something that most mines will consider, a severance package for employees at the end of the life of mine. But what if they are then suddenly held to account by stakeholders to say, actually, we're going to require an economic relocation of people at the end of the life of mine because there is nothing else. And this is quite conceivable in governments and countries where the economies are heavily dependent on mining. Botswana and Mongolia, for example, without mining, there's not a lot left. So given the complexity that we were already finding ourselves in, the current COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted, I think, how fragile our just-in-time economy has become to major shocks. The global economy really seems to operate in a permanent state of metastability, and it really relies on absolutely nothing going wrong so that it can deliver the growth and the returns that were promised to shareholders. Whilst it's probably too early to tell exactly how the crisis will affect the mining industry, I think one thing is certain. The world has really had a chance to pause and take stock of the impact that we and our consumption has on the planet and our future. So things are definitely not going to be the same going forward. I'm not sure whether the pause and the correction to global stock markets will allow companies to shift from the current short-termism to long-term thinking, which is crucial in an industry like mining, which is making decisions for 100 years' time. But I really am not sure which alternative future today's history is going to opt for, increased growth or increased stability. There may be no definitive answers to this, but I really hope that we will make the right choices because what is acceptable to society is changing. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Andy. I think that was a fantastic talk, building on what we've already heard earlier on today and giving us an awful lot of food for thought with regards to, yes, is it that increased growth or that increased stability? Because you're not going to get both in equal measure. So actually, where's the balancing point with regards to that? Now, there have been a number of questions coming in during your talk, you will be glad to know. And one of them actually is around some of the chatter that's going on YouTube at the moment. So yes, Rose and I are multitasking and looking at all the different feeds that are coming in. And actually the chatter around YouTube is almost focusing in on, well, you mentioned that it's easy to close a mine, but it's far more difficult to do it responsibly. So therefore, what does a responsibly closed mine actually look like?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I think, again, it depends on the mine and the environment that it finds itself in. So I think one survey of 57 mines that had closed in the last 70 years showed that about 9% of those mines were closed, officially closed. They had a closure certificate from the government that says you fulfilled all your obligations. So that normally means that it's not actively polluting the environment, or that the pollution levels are acceptable, is perhaps a better way of saying that. But again, the requirements for what is considered a closed mine are ever increasing. So what was acceptable 60, 70, 100 years ago is certainly not acceptable today. There are many examples across Europe where it's the current councils, it's us today that are paying for some of the practices that happened in the past. And I think really what a responsibly closed mine looks like is it's something that leaves the area better off than it was before mining commenced. And that for me is really the core essence of sustainable development. Development is about improvement. Sustainable means that it's making things better. We're not borrowing from the future in order to have a cushier today, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much for that, Andy. So we're looking at something that is better in the future and also for the long term. So we're not just thinking the next 10, 20 years, we are indeed thinking of that long-term basis as well. So with that, and this is maybe then coming back into your question around, or your concept of unforeseen events and that complexity, building on what John was saying. This is a question from Ruth, and she asks, in your experience, what proportion of unforeseen events influencing value during construction and operation were actually unforeseen rather than just missed or ignored? And could the lack of foresight of where we'd end up indicate a lack of effective governance at the exploration, pre-feasibility and various feasibility stages?
Well, without delving in any details, the last decade I've evaluated a number of very, very significant risks that have happened to mines. So they are now facts, they're no longer risks. Almost every single one of those was present on the risk register. So it's not that these were unforeseen events. Even COVID-19, one of the presidents mentioned a few years ago that this is an imminent reality for us and we need to be prepared for it. So I think the reality is that so many things that happen are foreseen, but the assumptions that we use are often very optimistic, sometimes overly optimistic. And this is normal. I think there's a psychological concept called optimism bias. And optimistic people tend to be successful people that tend to have very high flying jobs where they get to make very important decisions. So it's really not necessarily a case of these things are not known. I think there's just a huge reliance on hope that they're not going to happen, or that they're certainly not going to happen on my watch. And yes, it's not possible to protect against everything. It's too costly to protect against everything. But being on the right, in the correct area of the cost curve, so having a mine that gives you a little bit of contingency if things do go wrong, I think is critically important. So we aren't just really cutting it to the wire to say, well, you know, I can deal with 2 days of outage, but certainly not 2 weeks or 2 months. So giving yourself that comfort level, I think, is critical, especially when you're wanting to reduce the amount of risk, or at least the impact that risks would have on the longevity and the sustainability of the mine.
So making sure that the asset that you are mining is just better than everybody else's, so giving you more wiggle room.
or getting more metal out of less rock.
So Andy, last question, I think for you, and please everybody keep all your questions coming on whichever channel you're pushing at us from. This question comes from Ansu, and what Ansu says is, given the volatility of commodity prices and the effect on that cost curve that we've just been discussing, from your experience, would you recommend that regulators should demand a more progressive mine closure implementation? And if so, how do you think that would play out from the perspective of project economics?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think it's critical that we need to level the playing field, because it's not really fair to ask responsible miners to put money aside for the future and irresponsible miners to not do that. Now, there are some governments around the world that do require closure funds. Those are normally focused on environmental cleanup, but there are more and more that are requiring social closure costs to be set aside for. So when it comes to closure liabilities, what you'll typically see on most income statements at the moment is focused very much on environmental rehabilitation. But I think more and more there's an understanding that we can't have this boom-bust phenomenon where suddenly we're employing thousands of people, we've got massive influx of people into an area. When that mine is gone, whose problem is that? That's then the government's. And governments are saying, well, we can't afford to cover that cost either. So I think this is really about making sure that there is a win-win strategy that's developed from the outset to say, well, how can the mine, who's taking on all of the risk, and their shareholders, work together with local communities, with other stakeholders, with governments to say, what are we going to do at the end of this mine? What are the options available to us so that we really use the benefits that the ore gives to us to create a better today and a better future as well?
Fantastic, a good note to finish on there, Mr. Churr, sir. So thank you very much, and a big round of applause for you and for everybody, from everybody around the world. So thank you very, very much, Andy. That was great.